Okay, so yes, thank you so much for a fabulous summit. TCIJ team, thank you for holding space for one more conversation before we wrap up for another year as you fill out your surveys. And I'm sure it'll be a really, really excellent one. It's our honor to be sitting here with Dónal MacIntyre, acclaimed investigative journalist, TV presenter, and criminologist. So by way of introduction, I find two things fascinating about Dónal's career. First is his use of true crime as a medium, from its aesthetic to its delivery, how you deliver it, and also to its timeliness. Some of us may have watched episodes of Unsolved, which is a popular syndicated TV program, or have seen At Home with the Duggans, a miniseries produced by the Crime and Investigation Network. The medium is the message, as if you remember your Marshall McLuhan, right? And the 2010s up till now actually has had a very, very specific language in which it tells true crime stories. We inherit a lot of this, right? It's what makes them effective and compelling to, at that time, or, still a TV viewing public, but it was also a point where we saw the scattering of what was once a unified TV watching demographic across multiple networks and multiple screens. So this is something that you probably definitely recognize today. Dónal is a journalist who leveraged the, I'm quoting you here, the show me TV aesthetic to address that diffusion, and also while keeping the story at its center. Secondly, and most importantly, Dónal MacIntyre's choice of which stories to pursue are chosen from a deeply seated drive towards justice. Even when networks rate success in numbers and views and the like, Dónal's subjects are never about ratings or clicks, and it's actually holistically in step with what he knows his audience to want. Someone, a champion, who will show them that there's someone out there who will follow their thread to their end, even when our justice system has abandoned us. MacIntyre also brings his criminology background, which includes deeper knowledge of the legal system than others in, show me TV land, giving actual impact and hope to cold cases that need to be reopened and never to be forgotten. And so, please join me in welcoming Dónal MacIntyre.
Thanks very much for having me. I know you're all racing out to either catch trains or a last drink in the sunshine, but thanks for sharing this last hour with us. And I'm glad that you didn't edit much of my introduction, which I sent over. That's a joke, by the way. And I'm glad to see some people I work with today. But I think one of the things which I do, and I was talking to some other journalists today, is when we get a story, it's about perseverance, a story you believe in. There are some stories as journalists here we do to pay the bills because that's what we do. We've got to feed families. There are also some, we call them pot boilers, and that's fine, and they carry all their own legitimacy. But there are other stories which are driven from the heart, and I'm constantly contacted by families. And yes, there are true crime programs, and part of what myself and Professor David, my fellow academics, David Wilson, we call public criminology. Get out into the public through true crime medium, how the justice system works, the deficiencies of it, plus a deeper understanding of criminology. So back in the noughties, it was always, you either hang them and flog them. There was a high degree of the population in the UK who were in favour, for example, of death sentences, a la the US. But that now has completely changed because the true crime audience has become more sophisticated. They've grown as true crime programs have educated them, and as in part our journalism has, I think, sparked that. But as I say, a lot of the journalism we do comes from people who have gone down the end of the road, and major news organizations don't see the legitimacy because they're really busy on the news desk, and they're under real pressure to deliver either every week or every 4 months, or they don't see the legitimacy in your particular story. So a family would come to me and say, you know, we need your help. And I say, well, listen, we can put together a pro bono team of specialists, experts, and to investigate your case over years if necessary, and try and pursue the truth for you.
Yeah. So actually, I would love to give you the opportunity to introduce the most recent work that you're doing, revisiting I think it's a cold case, correct? Of a gentleman, or a young boy named Noah Donohoe?
Yeah, the Noah Donohoe case. So today, 5 years ago, Noah Donohoe at 9:40 in the morning, his body was found 960 meters in a storm drain within shooting distance, really, of Belfast Lough. It was an extraordinary story. He'd gone missing left to meet friends a couple of miles away from Belfast city centre. He was a biracial child, that's his mom's phrase, and he was Catholic, and his body was found in a storm drain in a predominantly loyalist area, a loyalist enclave. And it would be an area of the city where he would not be safe going normally, and he would never usually go. So there were lots of odd things about this particular case. But one of the most stridently and unusual things was he ended up cycling to an area, part of the city he would never go, and that he apparently didn't plan to go. And there was CCTV of him cycling naked at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And in that part of the city, which still I struggle with today, these were good people. They saw 3 families, saw him cycling by naked, clearly distressed, a 14-year-old skinny guy. You couldn't but be moved by the footage, and he fled then into a nearby park, the last time he was ever seen alive. Those who saw him did nothing. Nothing. And there are complicated reasons for that, before we pile in, as I initially did, because although the peace process reigned supreme, still more than 25 years afterwards, there remains a concern. Whatever you say nothing. What would have happened if perhaps, previously, if you had phoned the authorities and you didn't know the heritage of a particular incident, you could have been burnt out of your home. So there's all these legacy issues. So it's very complicated. This poor child was ultimately found down there, and there was a concern that there was a sectarian involvement in it, and that continues to this day. But although for part of the community, it remained just a standard with unusual components, missing persons case. There are 15 people go missing in Belfast every day. So
every day? Every
day. But which isn't that unusual, because every force in the UK is under significant pressure, what they call with missing persons fatigue. What I think was unusual about this particular case is that when it came to the inquest, and the inquest will take place in November, that over 300 documents were redacted by the Police Service of Northern Ireland and the Home Office and the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland on national security grounds. And you think, why would that be significant? And there may be complicated reasons for that. And then, of course, recently, and I think to one of the issues at hand today, I was contacted by somebody you met very recently and you were helping to train.
Yes, I do want to talk about that.
Yes, journalists from the Belfast Telegraph, Sam McBride, who told me that I had been surveilled and and my communications intercepted by the PSNI.
Yes. Okay, so let's actually, I definitely do want to give you space to talk about that, but sure. Just as, kind of to understand the implication of this particular case that you're revisiting, is that there are broader impacts for, like Northern Ireland in terms of the peace process, and also what happens in certain neighborhoods where, children like Noah are not welcome.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, it's a divided city. It's a wonderful peace there, so congratulations to both communities for making that peace work. But still, you scratch the surface and it is raw. And certainly in the silly season, when it comes to the celebration of King James, tensions run very high in the middle of the summer from around this time really to early July and July 12th. And this was a time where if it was seen to be a sectarian attack on Noah, and there's no evidence of that so far. But if it had been seen, the city would have gone up in a tinderbox, and the peace process would have been, placed to some degree under pressure, and that's what made it a political issue. And there were big concerns. So the police inevitably were trying to dampen all concerns around whether there was any involvement, sectarian involvement, but to give the community, the loyalist community, Protestant community in the Shore Road where Noah's body was found, they came out in their thousands along to support the search for Noah.
In the course of your reporting, not necessarily on this one, but probably in conjunction with, you personally as a journalist have faced a certain amount of surveillance, both physical and digital, and intimidation. Can your account, for those of you who actually are not aware of the story, another thing that came out fairly recently had to do with physical intimidation in terms of a break-in to your vehicle where you had documents pertaining to this particular case.
When Sam McBride from The Telegraph contacted me, I said that was really unusual, and it surprised me. It didn't surprise me that the PSNI, who have a long record of unlawful intrusion and really they really hold journalists in zero regard and have no real trust in the role that journalists play in a democracy, and no real understanding of it. It's really underdeveloped. But I said to Sam, that's very unusual, because at the time when I was handing over to the coroner a 12,500 word report, which is in part financed by a crowdfunding initiative, my car was broken into in Heathrow Airport. And at the time, I'd phoned the Heathrow police, and they said, well, it's very odd. We'll investigate. Then they came back, and the Metropolitan Police said, they recognized that I was an investigative journalist. They said, did you have anything in the car? And I said, well, I did have specific paperwork related to the Noah Donoghue investigation. And I'd asked the authorities in Heathrow, and they said there were no cameras in the long-term car park in Heathrow. And
one British person's reaction to that statement.
And this is one of the most, surveilled airports on the planet, in one of the most surveilled cities in the world, and that didn't ring true to me. So this was raised with the Police Service of Northern Ireland, who claim they've now turned over a new leaf, and they denied it. First of all, a police force will say nothing. And eventually, the public clamour got to such an extent that they came out and they admitted they were surveilling my open source communications and digital communications. But I think the interesting thing for that is, of course, and I won't reveal any new lines, but there are obviously concerns about what programs they were using in order to do that. And we know that there are many other journalists who you've spoken to who've already been the subject of unlawful intrusion by the PSNI.
Yes, and so in my research into this particular event, something that I thought was really telling was in their explanation regarding the break into your car, they pretty much said, if we wanted to break into your car, you would never know. That's what they said.
Well, I did see that, and I thought raised a little wry smile with that. On the other hand, the car looked like a complete wreck, and but I was once interviewed by a journalist from The Independent who said that my car resembled an archaeological dig, and that was before the PSNI broke into it. I was very offended by that comment because it was so true, but what a great line. No, I think the reality is, for investigative journalists, is that there is no safe haven from police intrusion. And for the most part, they'll be investigating us and using all sorts of, sometimes, and the concern with the PSNI was in some cases, like in that case, didn't seem to be any court order, but there have been rogue units within the PSNI and other forces who've just taken upon themselves to use whatever resources they have just to surveil you. And of course, there are other protections, but whatever protections you have, your redress will be 5 years down the line.
Okay. I mean, so just from your experience, like globally, do you have any perspective on how that differs in other countries that we all might come from? Because, I mean, you know, like journalism, public interest journalism is incredibly often seen as threatening to those in power. But this is why it's so important to fight for it.
Well, I remember people say to me, I first came to public attention really when I did a lot of undercover work, and people said, oh my goodness, you go undercover with everybody, including Mother Teresa. And that was true. I did go undercover in Mother Teresa's care home. And I found, and it was appalling, shocking. It was literally shocking. I got a tip-off from 2 Irish nurses who'd been in the Romanian care, orphanages and also over with Mother Teresa's after she died. And in fact, they were no better when she was alive. Really extraordinary, cruel places. Children disabled, children were tied up, chained to their cots, and it was horrific. And when we dashed over to do that for a piece for Sky News and Channel 5, and on the way, word had got out, and the Indian security forces are very robust and not shy. And as we tried to get out of the country, we tried to separate the tapes. So one of my fixers is a non-dom Indian, and he was arrested at the airport and detained. When I was on the airport, I carried 2 passports. I'm on the lookout for any number, Irish and American, and so I travelled in on my Irish and out of my American. But I was very concerned because we had booked our return flights. And they were sequential tickets. So I got pulled in. I could see this guy circling around me. Paul hadn't arrived at the gate. Security was circling around me, a guy with very dark glasses. And I'm thinking, I'm in trouble here. And then I got pulled over. And it was interesting because the British Airways staff were interrogating me on behalf, rather inappropriately, of the Indian security services, wondering, well, where is your friend? Are you traveling together? I said, I have no idea you're talking about. No, I got my flight reconfirmed at the hotel, and they must have done both at the same time. So I blagged my way around that and found myself on the plane. And when I was on the plane, I put my tapes in another compartment well away from my seat number, then sat down on my seat number, and then all of a sudden I could see some activity at the front of the plane before the plane took off, and I said, this is not looking good. And then I could see Senior Purser coming down, said, Mr. MacIntyre, could you please follow me? And I thought, this is not looking good. And they put me in first class and said, oh, listen, love your work, thanks very much, there you have it. So, anyway, but it is, taking on Mother Teresa, because she, whoever you are and whatever your organization is, you should be held to account, least of all somebody who has had that reputation as a Catholic, and she was educated in Ireland, my home country. But it shows you that security services, were railing to protect that reputation And it took some weeks for my colleague to be released. So even on something which isn't involving international terrorism or police or espionage, the dangers are still there.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's actually cycle back to this saga, working on the Donahue story. There's also an element of digital surveillance, and it's impacted you in ways that were like immediate to see, but then also reverberates across this entire industry, especially where PSNI is involved. I know that there was a special operation that they spun up, like just to monitor your social media, but also to do whatever else. Can you say more to that?
Well, we don't. It's kind of when Sam McBride told me, he said this is happening to you. It's also happening to a number of other journalists, and actually to a much greater degree. And as you know from your recent visit there, over 300 journalists, and we didn't know there were 300 journalists on the payroll of anybody in Northern Ireland. So fantastic, who were being surveilled. So it was open season.
You're employable. Bad news, you're surveilled.
Yeah. So open season by the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and I kind of wasn't really surprised. The implication for that is that at the moment, the coronial service, the coroner, is leading the investigation. It was assumed that there was no crime perpetrated, and yet there are many concerning elements to it. So now, myself and my team have been asked by the coroner, working with the police, to deliver all our tapes, all our work for 5 years of work and contacts and everything, carte blanche demand, request from the coroner for the material. And living and working between the Republic of Ireland, a different jurisdiction, and the UK, a different jurisdiction, and carrying an American passport, you can now see where we might have our footage and our digital assets, and how that we would robustly defend and tell the coroner, you're not getting the material, we've already assisted you. But it is a reminder, and I've had another request for other material on another cold case, the murder of Sophie Toscan de Plantier, which I did a series with Jim Sheridan on Sky, and they've asked for all the tapes. And the cold case team from the Guard, it's a very controversial case there. So you feel as if you're on the right side of the moral compass in journalism when you're being harangued by a coroner on this side and by a cold case team demanding all your material on the other. And you must always robustly defend that, because within that material you might think you've protected your sources,
yes,
but something inadvertent will release that. And your number one obligation is to protect your sources. And if you're a young journalist and you don't care, and you've been the beach over in Thailand, wherever, you don't mind going to jail and building a reputation to protect your sources. But no organization can defend you and protect your sources if you don't protect your own source. And that is increasingly difficult, if I think nearly impossible, because we were talking about this earlier. The most vulnerable part of any source is the outreach, the first point of contact, ground zero for a relationship, because at some stage that inevitably will be through a Gmail or some kind of contact like that, not through Signal, and that means, and they will have no idea of the protocols they should be taking, and it comes in effectively, and they can access all that material, and that's where a lot of the damage is done.
Okay. I mean, so thinking over, since the noughties to the present day, how has your approach to contacting sources, or that first contact conundrum, how has that evolved? And what technologies do you feel still work? What technologies are new that you've pulled into the fold?
Well, I've been kind of surprised, because I don't operate in the area of espionage, and I don't operate in the area of state secrets. I have in the past, bought, Semtex and guns abroad, and it's more of kind of to show the issues around the purchase of these illegal items and things like that. But it hasn't. I haven't expected to be part of that, of a surveillance network. I'd have thought, frankly, that the security services would be interested in bigger and more important things. But I think the lessons we learn is that whatever you're involved in, the act of being a journalist, the act of being curious, the act of having a public conscience, and trying to act in the public interest is so anathema. It's seen as such a threat to many in the security forces, to many in the police, and I'm sure the chief constables aren't making these decisions. Sometimes they're percolated up. But the investigative reporter or the journalist, investigative or not, in that particular genre, you're regarded as a threat to democracy, when in fact you are one of the foundations, stones of democracy. And the problem is, in order to reach the level of chief constable, you have to be such a cog in the machine. They just simply are institutionally denied the possibility of understanding that, their role is as a public servant to support the public. Their role is not to control and coerce. And that's where I think, certainly in the PSNI Northern Ireland, but I honestly think we have no idea of the extent of surveillance by the security services and police forces going not just on journalists, but on private citizens in this country.
So do you think it's all for naught? You mentioned like Signal, Gmail, et cetera. Do you feel that no matter between Gmail and Signal, it's definitely better to communicate with someone over Signal than it is over Gmail for a variety of reasons. But do you still feel that it might be, just it doesn't matter? Well,
I think, the security services, they have to operate in the dark, and we have blessed with social media. So often the truth, there's the line, a lie will run around the world before the truth catches up. But actually now, the truth does have an opportunity to run around with social media. And so by getting things out, so at the moment, I think it's kind of a score draw, but I think from what we know, and bearing in mind we know a fraction of what we understand the security forces and the police are doing, particularly with regard to journalists and others who they deem to be a threat. But at the moment, I'm always positive because you have no option but to be. But I am shocked that in something as innocuous as a missing children's case, or indeed in a case involved Sophie Toscan de Plantier case, which again is a very tragic case, but this is not matters of state where the police would come in very heavy-handed and consider these very robust tactics like surveillance and like, major court orders demanding access to your material.
Okay, so one of the themes that I always love to return to in terms of the communications between a journalist and their source is called the asymmetry of preparedness. You are a seasoned professional, with the benefit of 20 or more years in the field. 30, okay. And yay!
Great.
And
braying, yeah.
And then you also have have encountered and will continue to encounter sources who never thought that you would be the person that they reach out to. And so while you know what to do in order to address these issues, they do not. How do you take any particular precautions, or do you have any language or tips and tricks in order to bring that source up to the level where you can continue to work in confidentiality for the story?
Well, I think my first dimension is always to tell them explain to them the likely cost of their intervention if their role is discovered. And I don't sugarcoat it. And I'm honest with them entirely. I said, if you do this, this will happen, this will happen. The worst case scenario, even if it's a best case scenario, this will happen. So so they have to, often they may come very ingenue, innocent of potential implications. But I think the first thing is you have to, as a journalist, and there are many journalists who would just say, give me the story, and literally have a scorched earth. And I think, and that's what they do, and they make fine reputation. reputations and they make a lot of money, or they don't make a lot of money. But I think, you build your own moral map and around that. So you have to just explain to them, this is the bad news. And then you say, insofar as you can, build an alternative platform for communication, then you'd work that out. And also you'd say to them, there are times for them to bail out. It's kind of, when I work in academia, it's a bit like an academic study. At any time, somebody participating in the study can bail out. And that's kind of the way we work I work with my sources. There is a difficulty in that when you're working with sources and a major broadcaster. So I work myself with a company in the Republic, and on my own operate myself as a singular entity and my own corporate entities. But the issue is, when you're working with a broadcaster or a newspaper, they cannot necessarily protect you. So you've got to protect your source and tell your source to be very careful about, who they talk to.
So the broadcaster cannot protect the source, or they cannot protect you in protecting the source?
Well, both. Yeah. Both. I mean, the thing about it is, I remember I was libeled. I did a care home investigation, and in very complicated circumstances, the Kent police decided that I had unfairly claimed that there was abuse in this care home, and even though that they'd given cautions for assault in the care home, and I wondered how many cautions would demonstrate a good care home or a bad care home, because I thought actually abuse shouldn't really be anywhere near a care home. In any case, Kent police, they castigated my program, and it went out, and that castigation in an internal report was placed in the front cover of the Sunday Telegraph, and it was really a death knell for my career. And I remember thinking, okay, this is a death knell for my career, it's over. And people said that to me, and it was clear. But I knew actually would define my journalism more than kill it off, although it took 2 years to clear my name. And the Kent police, I sued them for libel, and I sued them for libel, and there'd never been a successful libel suit against the police force in this country, least of all from a journalist. And I remember the BBC, they said they didn't want to get involved in a public service scrap, least of all with a journalist who was, they can sacrifice any journalist. They're the best broadcasters in the world, but again, they're very imperfect. But they will always sacrifice, a journalist if necessary. For corporately. So I said, well, I'm suing. And they said, well, you don't have the money. I said, well, I pretended that I had access to the resources. And in the end, they believed me, because they were more concerned about having one of their own suing in their good name of their journalism and not backing it. So in the end, they did back me, and they financed my legal team to sue the Kent police, and we sued, and it transpired they were well aware that there was abuse in the care home, and for some reason they denigrated me because they were in a previous row with the BBC. But in any case, the BBC were not initially prepared to back me until I said, well, listen, I don't need your support. And then they felt, that reputationally they had to support me. So don't think at any stage that any major organization is going to back you over their own, corporate imperatives. So there's a great freedom, but also vulnerability in being an independent investigative reporter. I was saying to somebody outside that, being an investigative reporter, it's like being a poet. You'll never make money. And I know, because my old man was a poet, so.
That's good. I'm curious about the way that, or you mentioned, and I forget exactly the term that you use, but it's like public investigation, is that correct? When we talk about criminology, we talk about public criminology, about espousing and educating the public through true crime medium. But as I say, the journalism that I do, some of it would be classically in the true crime genre, some of it would be very access, anthropological, and some would be, very, traditional investigative. And I think when we write our books or we do our podcasts, you're just using the
device or the medium to get the story out. We're all still storytellers, and as my father would say, you know, tell the story start, middle, and end, though not necessarily in that order. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, what is it like to build a team in order to do public criminology?
Well,
because I noticed like you pull in like a number of like different experts.
Well, we would pull in, I mean, I've a Rolodex. I don't actually have a Rolodex, just my mobile phone number, but that's what they say, get the Rolodex out. And I can call upon experts who are world-renowned experts in forensic video analysis, or who are experts in investigative techniques, digital techniques, and I can call them in and we bring them over to meet, in this case, Fiona Donohoe, Noah Donohoe's mom. And they'd come over, and I brought Clive Driscoll, who's the most successful murder detective in this country, who solved the Stephen Lawrence case, a long-term friend of mine. And I brought him over to do what we call a criminological autopsy of the case, and he solved the intractable Stephen Lawrence case. So this was intractable, and that case had a lot of problems with the police and distrust, and still does. And he recognized a lot of the issues in the Lawrence case being replicated and mimicked by the PSNI and their relationship with the family. So he's one of the type of experts we bring in. But this is how he solved the Lawrence case. So we called it criminological autopsy. So he took all the files related to the statements, and he sat down where Stephen was murdered at the bus stop in Eltham, and he sat there for weeks and weeks, and he kept building a picture of the time, the traffic, the flow. And suddenly he realized this wasn't an 8-second attack. This was a 40 to 60-second attack. And suddenly now, and we're not to know this, but he discovered this, that basically the level and the type of forensic tests you do in a 40 to 60 minutes attack and an 8 to 0 seconds attack are very, very different. So then he made the case, and in the politics, it's not about, many people think it's, when you get you just throw a forensics team at it. It's a fight for budget. So a successful prosecution often depends not on the science of forensics, but the politics of forensics. So Clive Driscoll fought really hard to get a new forensics investigation done on the Lawrence investigation, £3 million, and he had to fight with doctorates in forensic technology and professors and arguing his case. And he tells me the story that this professor saying to him, "Listen, we've done all the tests that are necessary. You can't do any more, and I've got a doctorate in this, and you can't be telling me And Clive said, well." I've had a D in woodwork in my GCSE, and I'm the senior investigating officer, and that's what we're going to do. So they spent £3 million. When I brought him over to Northern Ireland, so when Noah was discovered naked, there were items of his clothing and his bike were left strewn in the streets, which were eventually collected by the PSNI. What do you think the PSNI did with those critical exhibits? At this stage, Noah is still missing. We have no idea if he was stripped, if he voluntarily took his clothes off, or what happened and he was missing. What do we think the police did with those exhibits? No, well, they effectively destroyed them. They should have bagged them and protected them, but no, they didn't. They left the bike out in the rain overnight because there's no room in the police station, and they left all the clothes and exhibits open there for other officers to open at the police station. And, you're just thinking, such incompetence and disregard, because the explanation given by the PSNI, which shocked Clive and also shocked me, was that, well, at that stage, there was we had no idea and no sense that a crime may be involved in here, so we just didn't bother doing that. So these are the kind of things which we challenge and which we bring one of our experts in. And so getting, particularly in Northern Ireland, where people race to sides, and they often don't say it, and the issue of it's very good to get outside voices in to look at a case like that.
Wow, it's fascinating. So, well, take it, or if, I don't know if any of you remember Goofus and Gallant where from PSNI's perspective, that is the wrong way to collaborate with a team around something as important as that. Within your team, as Gallant, what do you, when you're working with other investigators, do to preserve the confidentiality and the security of the materials as you work on it? I know that you definitely did mention that, you're always going to have to interact with law enforcement who, might request, documents that you've been working on in order for their purposes. Well, but from the day to day,
yeah. Well, fortunately, there's a practicality here is that, so you run the risk. So me communicating with Clive is not a big issue. When I told Clive that our communications were likely surveilled, and he just said, well, no problems there. The security services already know how distressed I am about the performance of Fulham. And so Clive wasn't bothered by it because a lot of what we communicate, on the phone on a certain level wouldn't be of particular relevance or vulnerability. But we will meet face-to-face as often as we can, and I'm all reminded that actually I saw a report a couple of years back that some of the spying agencies were back to the typewriter, and I understand why that might be very attractive, because
I have a very hard. I can't imagine a bunch of 20-something-year-olds learning how to use a typewriter. That's crazy.
Yeah. Well, when I remember, and this is how old I am, when I was at the Irish Press in Dublin starting out, and the union demanded then £5,000 payout to allow all of us who were on typewriters, to move on to computers. That paper folded, that decision. And I think it's super difficult, but sometimes face-to-face meetings, are often best. And actually, AI will replace a lot of what journalists will do, but they will not replace face-to-face human communication. And they'll replicate what's already on the net, but they don't generate fresh insights, which investigators can do. And as Cormac, good friend of mine, is out there, he did say what's very interesting right now is that there's very little money and work being done in investigative journalism. But that means there is so much amazing low-hanging fruit out there everywhere you turn. So if you have the ability, and most investigative reporters I know, work in their spare time, over hours. They're not working in, they literally are, working to McDonald's wages if you counted the hours they worked, because you do this because you have a passion for it and you're not on counting your holidays or counting your hours because you simply couldn't. But I think for us and with sources, most of our experts understand and they come from often a security background or they've been surveilled before. But it's a constant tension.
Yeah, well, that actually segues very, very nicely to my last question before we open it up to the audience for Q&A. What's the future of true crime in general? This is one of my favorite guilty pleasures as a media consumer, but so many of us are interested in this as a career path, right? This is a genre to explore. I'd love to hear what you think about, the different formats, podcasts, digital series for platforms like Netflix, as well as still, while we have them, traditional news organizations.
Well, I think NPR started out with first with the podcast exploring in incredible depth. And traditionally, the true crime story, or most stories, or mysteries, were told in a television hour. So it would be 53 minutes or 54 minutes for the ITV hour, or it would be the full 60 minutes, or Channel 4, 45, or in America even less, with the ad breaks. And then when the podcast came out, you realize that people were intrinsically fascinated by the detail, they understood that some of these stories could last for hours and episodically, and I think that has changed. That drove the interest in true crime. But actually, I think it's slightly a misnomer. True crime, it's very good. It's a very good brand,
yeah.
But actually, it's just storytelling, and we've always been fascinated by deviants, those who break the law. Most of all, by those who do the most egregious of crime, take a human life. And even George Orwell was concerned and preoccupied when he wrote the death of the great British murder, which were, historically, the news of the world, or some variation. It would be some pastor or some vicar had killed some prostitute, and you had all these wonderful dynamics, which to a writer would be very exciting. So I think we've always been interested in that, but I think what's challenging now and really exciting is that the standards of journalism has never been higher in terms of fact-checking, the ability to fact-check. I think there are people testing it. There are also these citizens journalists who sometimes contaminate crime scenes and cause great distress, but some of them also perform incredibly, important functions and crack cases that traditional professional journalists don't do. So I think it will, I don't see it as true crime. I think it's storytelling, and there's every variation of the investigation. It's people are still fascinated, and they always have been.
And they always will be, actually. So can you say more to the the financial models behind that? Because I don't know, I don't even know how to ask this question, but I'm super curious. What is it like to produce, a 4-part series for a streaming platform versus working with BBC or True TV or what is that like?
Most programming is now done by independent broadcasters and financed in part by multiple sales, either to one single broadcaster and then a distributor. So the model we did with a very British gangster, which went to Sundance, a feature doc, is that we produced 2 programs for Channel 5, and I was one of their voice of current affairs at the time, and I produced and directed that, and then we combined that into a feature doc, which we brought to Sundance, sent that to cinema, and then that went around the world, and then we got a second hit on that at home with the Noonans. In relation to Murder at the Cottage, a 5-part series at Sky, I started doing some articles on that with Ian Bailey, who's a murder suspect, and I was over in Cork last week for the scattering of his ashes. An extraordinary case where he was convicted of murder of a French woman in Ireland by a French court, but the Irish authorities never charged him because they didn't feel enough evidence. So he was free for his final years in Ireland while a convicted murderer in France. And myself and Jim Sheridan were interested in this. I brought it to the BBC. The BBC were interested. The head of the BBC documentaries then moved to Netflix. I brought the story to Netflix. In the end, Netflix went with Simon Chin, a very good documentary maker. They wouldn't take Jim Sheridan, Oscar 6 times as a director, so we went on and did our own. So we had a battleground between Netflix and Sky, and we got funding from the Irish Film Board, and so all sorts of very difficult and excruciating, financial models. And on this Noah Donoghue case, we were self-funded, and we also got crowdfunding to the tune of 175,000, which continues to support the book, the feature documentary, which will come out afterwards, and also probably a podcast. But it's complicated models for the independent investigator, and What else are you going to do? Just chase the money to do the kind of work you feel is important.
Yeah. How is crowdfunding? Do you feel that that's like a sustainable, or like, would you encourage that as a component within a fundraising strategy if you want to pursue an independent project like that?
Well, I think so. I think it is a great vehicle. The NOAA case was so profoundly important to predominantly to people in Northern Ireland that we raised 175,000 very, very quickly because it was important. We also ran a campaign. We supporting videos, releasing stories, working with newspapers to generate around that. But most importantly, we had the support of the family who understood that, 4 years in, you can't really continue to do the investigation, flying over to Northern Ireland, bringing in experts, paying for expert reports, all these things, as well as, 10, 20, 30 days of filming. You can't do that all pro bono. So it's been very useful.
Okay. That's really, really fascinating. Yeah. Last question. Any more advice to aspiring true crime investigative journalists?
Well, I wouldn't say true crime. I just say any journalist is just a curiosity is your friend, and be consistent. Treat your sources and contributors well and sincerely, and whoever will bring you a story in the first year of your journalistic career will definitely bring you a story in the third decade of your career. And if you look after them well, good manners, and as best you can, keep your ethics straight. Yeah.
And that's the word. Thank you so much, everyone. Dónal MacIntyre.